The Last Starfighter was more than just another intergalactic adventure. It was the first movie to get rid of miniatures and use full-blown CGI dogfights instead. This was a risky move that almost ruined the whole thing. But beneath the lights and the starships, it was pandemonium inscribed in pixels. We didn't get the star we wanted, not by a long stretch. One scene was so gloomy that it had to be cut down to get a PG rating. And what about the director? He once put on the mask of Michael Myers. Here are 20 strange things you might not know about The Last Starfighter. And in the glow and terror, one high score made a player the galaxy's final hope. This wasn't just a sci-fi story, it was the daydream that changed the future. Number 1. The idea for The Last Starfighter didn't come from a studio boardroom, it came from the flashing lights of an arcade. Jonathan Betchell, a screenwriter, watched a teenager chase a high score. The adolescent was sweating and had his eyes glued to the screen. Betchell pondered, what if this wasn't simply a game? What if it was a quiz? A tool for hiring? That idea became the movie's hook. Alex Rogan is a kid who lives in a trailer park and beats the game, only to find out that it's a secret test to find starfighters for a cosmic battle. Even Universal was hesitant about the idea since it was so radical, but the arcade craze of the early 1980s made it impossible to ignore. Kids all around the country were putting quarters into machines, and Betul's script turned that fascination into fate. A high score, a luminous screen, and a joystick. That was all it needed to get to the stars. 2. Alex Rogan wasn't always a youngster from a trailer park. In early drafts, his story took place in a beautiful suburb with picket fences and neat lawns, but Universal thought it was too similar to E.T., a lad next door who stares to the stars. Jonathan Betchell, the scriptwriter, made a big modification. He put Alex in a trailer park that was full with dust. It gave the movie substance, put his family in the middle of working-class struggles, and made a big difference when Alex suddenly found himself in the middle of alien armadas and cosmic conflicts. The trailer park also gave him a sense of community, with neighbors who clapped for him when he won at Starfighter. Who thought of him as one of their own? His jump into the stars felt grander, lonelier, and more heroic because of that small, grounded environment. Alex wasn't getting away from the suburbs. He was getting away from being poor, bored, and stuck in the future. That location gave the final Starfighter its heart and its edge. Number 3. Lance Guest became Alex Rogan, but the studio didn't choose him first. Wanted a rising star who could carry the movie only by being famous. People thought about Michael J. Fox during the breakout of Family Ties, but his schedule for the show precluded him from doing it. Eric Stoltz also tried out for Mask and briefly Back to the Future. There was even a question mark next to Maggie's job. Before Catherine Mary Stewart got the part, names like Jennifer Jason Leigh were thrown about. Because of the apparent chemistry with Guest. In the end, it wasn't the most famous names that prevailed, it was being real. Guest and Stewart weren't famous yet, but they seemed real together. Two kids in love who live in a dead-end town suddenly become caught up in something far bigger. The casting didn't make stars, it made the story believable. Before Nick Castle signed on, Universal tried to get James Cameron, a new director who had just made a big splash in Hollywood, to direct. Cameron was ready for his next major sci-fi project right after The Terminator. For a while, it seemed like he might be in charge of The Last Starfighter, but his plans got in the way and Cameron went in a different direction. Instead, he jumped into Aliens and the Abyss and left Castle in charge of Starfighter. It's one of those fun what-ifs. A Last Starfighter directed by James Cameron may have been darker, grittier, and more technically adventurous. Instead, the movie we received was a mix of Nick Castle's fairy tale optimism and cutting-edge CGI. A completely different vision from Cameron's characteristic intensity. History split at that point. Cameron produced Titans and creatures from the abyss. Castle made a video game that went to the stars. Did Chris Columbus indicate he wanted to stay home? No. What if the Wright brothers decided that only birds should be able to fly? And did Goloka think the Ulus were too hideous to save? Who's this Goloka? Forget it. 5. Nick Castle was not only the director of The Last Starfighter. Horror enthusiasts knew him by a different name. The guy who wore the mask on Halloween. Castle was a college classmate of John Carpenter. Carpenter called Castle because he required a scary, quiet presence for Michael Myers. Castle became the Shape, one of horror's most famous characters, when he put on the mask. But in 1984, he took a leap of faith. From a killer with no face to a sci-fi dreamer. He traded Carpenter's shadows for computer-generated starlight in The Last Starfighter, showing that he could go from simple fear to big ideas. It gave the movie a distinctive pace. The man who used to scare people now wrote a story of hope, love, and destiny, with no mask on and chasing the stars. 6th. Most spacefights in 1984 still used miniatures, which were model ships on wires filmed against starfields. The Last Starfighter tossed all of that away. Instead, it took a chance on something new, full-blown computer graphics. The movie lasts for 27 minutes. Most of the ships in Dogfight were made on a machine instead of a model shop. The Cray XMP supercomputer was that machine. There are only 6 of them in the world. Each frame had more than 250,000 polygons, which was much more than people had ever seen before. This made the Gunstar look less like a toy on strings and more like a digital dream that had been stolen straight from an arcade screen. But the miracle almost fell apart. The computers almost choked when animators tried to make the Gunstar's greatest weapon, the spinning Death Blossom. The Cray crashed over and over again because it couldn't handle the weight of its own desire. The light trails and explosions were too much for it. Hollywood's advertising made it sound like it was faster and cheaper than models. What is the truth? It was weak, moody, and barely held together. But it worked, even though it was hard. That bet changed the future of movies and made way for Jurassic Park, Terminator 2, and every other digital war since. The Gunstar didn't only shoot guns, it was the first movie to use CGI. 7. The evil villain Jur wanted to show how nasty he was in a horrible way. By frying a spy's brain with his scepter, which was shown on a big screen. The whole scene was filmed, with glowing skin, a quivering torso, and everything else. But Nick Castle, the director, pulled it back. The scene was cut down to nearly nothing to make the PG ratings safe. There was only a flash of red on the victim's forehead. What could have been? One of the most disturbing PG moments of the 1980s disappeared into the editing room? The funny thing is, The Last Starfighter came out just a few weeks before the PG-13 rating came out. Castle could have kept the whole scenario if he had waited. Instead, one of the most stunning parts of the movie was cut down to a shot that you could miss in a flash. 8. Centauri's star car looked like something out of a pulp sci-fi movie on screen. Shiny, smooth, and modern. But it was a nightmare on set. The car was loud, clumsy, and very slow. Every time it had to make a big entry, the crews had to fight with the mechanics to get it to roll in a straight line. The dazzling gullwing doors got stuck, the fiberglass body rattled, and what appeared like easy speed on film was often a mix of careful camera angles and editing trickery. Nick Castle later said that shooting with the automobile was more annoying than entertaining. It was a cosmic hot rod made for the screen, but in actual life, it was barely safe to drive. A sign of The Last Starfighter's charm. Brilliant in thought but sloppy in action. Robert Preston was the inspiration for number 9, Centauri, the clever recruiter who gets Alex to go to the stars. People remembered him as Harold Hill in The Music Man, a fast-talking salesperson with a twinkle in his eye. Centauri was basically Hill reincarnated in space, a con guy turned cosmic guru. The part was remarkable for Preston. It was his last performance on stage, a curtain call full of stardust. His charming timing on stage provided The Last Starfighter its heartbeat, making the CGI show feel more real with old-school Hollywood charm. It wasn't simply a character leaving as Centauri drove off in his bright star car. It was Preston's last goodbye, a last bow from a Broadway star who had been remade as a salesman in space. So farewell, Alex. Have a good time. 10. Wil Wheaton almost got his start in The Last Starfighter before he became Wesley Crusher on Star Trek: The Next Generation. He played Lewis's pal in the trailer park and filmed a few lines while hanging out in Alex Rogan's universe. But when the movie came out, most of his scenes were cut. Wheaton was just a hazy child in the backdrop who was hard to see unless you knew where to look. His relatives made fun of him for being in the movie, but it never really happened. 2 years later, Wheaton got the part in Stand By Me, and then in Star Trek. In the end, the child who got lost in the editing room became a sci-fi legend. Sometimes the parts you don't be remembered for are merely stepping stones to the ones that transform your life. 11. Kids left theaters in 1984 with only one thing on their minds: the arcade game. Alex Rogan's win at the Starfighter cabinet had sent him into space on television. They must have imagined there was a real machine waiting for them at pizza places and bowling alleys. Atari even teased it in the credits of the movie and made functional prototypes, whole cabinets with illuminated controls and gameplay that was like the Space Wars in the movie. But the dream died before it got to the arcade floor. The 1983 video game catastrophe had hurt Atari so badly that the release was cancelled. The prototypes ended up in warehouses, and fans spent years following rumors of a game that never really existed. Finally, 6 years later, a NES cartridge came out with the moniker Last Starfighter. But it was a cruel trap. It wasn't the movie-like dogfights youngsters had expected. It was only a reskin version of another game called Uridium. No arcade release, no chance to test your fate, just a made-up story and a bogus console tie-in. It became one of the biggest disappointments in cinema history for gamers, a neon sign that promised something but never delivered. The beta unit, Alex Rogan's android double that he left behind on Earth, was never meant to be more than a joke. The real Alex was fighting in the stars while a clumsy stand-alike tried to get by in a little village. But when test audiences viewed early versions, they enjoyed how Beta's humor was awkward. His weird smile, stiff gestures, and attempts to act like a person that didn't work. Every time, it made people laugh. The people who made the movie listened. They added fresh scenes to Beta's part. It was a win for the crowd. It was agony for Lance Guest. He had already cut his hair by the time they had to reshoot, so he had to wear a stiff wig that never looked right under the lights. The prosthetics were thick and heated, and they kept the heat in till he almost passed out. Worse, Guest was sick for most of the shoot, so every day in that latex felt like punishment. Beta was a fan-favorite weirdo who made people laugh on film. He was sad and rubber behind the scenes. Later, the Guest quipped that Beta almost broke him, which shows that what makes us laugh on television often comes from someone else's anguish. Lewis, go back to sleep or I'll tell Ma about your Playboys. You're messing it up, Alex. What the hell? Said, Lewis, go back to sleep, or I'll tell them all about your Playboys. 13. Alex and Maggie weren't always the same people. They were dubbed Skip and Penny in the first versions, which made them sound like cartoon characters instead than real teens. Nick Castle, the director, despised it. He didn't think the story was a silly comic strip. It was about two normal kids who were put in strange situations. He wanted names that were more down-to-earth and fit the small-town trailer park setting. The change works. It was easy to believe that Alex and Maggie were real individuals. Kids you could see in a petrol station or a cafe on the corner. Their names helped ground the fantasy in reality, reminding people that this was still a love story about two small-town dreamers, even with all the CGI dogfights and alien battles. Oh, number 14. One daring idea almost gave The Last Starfighter the strangest studio logo in Hollywood history. The creators wanted to start with Rylos, the alien planet at the center of the plot, instead of Universal's famous globe. The goal was to throw moviegoers right into space, making it hard to tell where the studio ends and the movie universe begins. But the people in charge at Universal said no. They were afraid it would confuse people, which is one of the most important rules of branding. Don't mess with the logo. The plot was thrown out, and the movie started with Earth after all. It's a small what-if, the kind of imaginative touch that could have given the movie a sense of being an outsider from the very first frame. Instead, the movie played it safe and let Rylos show itself later among the stars. The Gunstar, the Last Starfighter's famous starship, was unlike anything people had seen in 1984. Visionary artist Ron Cobb, who had already worked on Alien, Conan the Barbarian, and Back to the Future, designed it. It wasn't made up of parts from other models like the ships in Star Wars. The idea and the final product were both made on a computer. Cobb's design used smooth, angular symmetry, which worked nicely on the digital canvas. The Gunstar seemed like the future when it was made in CGI for the movie. It was a ship made of polygons instead of glue and plastic. For fans, it became one of the first totally digital icons in movies, along with the X-Wing and the Falcon of the Millennium. The Gunstar didn't simply fight in a war in space, it fought its way into movie history. 16. The Last Starfighter had Tron DNA running through it. A lot of the visual effects artists had just worked on Disney's pioneering 1982 project, which brought their digital skills to Universal. Some leftover concept art from Aliens even made it into the mix, changing the look of Rylos and its alien fleets. The Last Starfighter's unique look came from this bloodline. Shiny, like an arcade, and a little strange. It didn't appear like the Star Wars universe, which was grimy and lived in. It looked like something you could almost play, like a video game come to life. That choice caused a lot of arguments at the time, but looking back, it helped the movie stand out. It didn't want to be Star Wars. It was something weirder, shinier, and decades ahead of its time. You don't have many followers, and they are all over the place. Star League. A safe place for weak worlds and a place where we may be equals. 17. The Last Starfighter, like Labyrinth, Blade Runner, and Raiders of the Lost Ark, got the Marvel Comics treatment. In 1984, Marvel released a 3-issue adaptation that brought the tale of the movie to life in bright, vivid panels. For a lot of fans, it was the only chance to experience the adventure after the movie was no longer in theaters. The adaptation used Ron Cobb's sleek spacecraft designs and even added to several sequences, which played up the pulpy, cosmic style that Marvel loved. As time went on, the miniseries became a collectible piece of 80s sci-fi marketing, a reminder of how comic book stores used to be the only place to find movies that weren't yet on VHS. It seemed natural that the movie's afterlife resided in a different medium where imagination could run free, since it was based on arcade games. I need to get my ears fixed now. I'm dying here. What is going on? You're having a really bad dream. Get some sleep. Lewis. 18. Universal intended The Last Starfighter to be their own version of Star Wars. The studio wanted toys, sequels, and a huge empire of merchandise. Plans were made for tie-in products, prototypes were drawn up, and hopes were set quite high. But the box office didn't bring in the huge numbers that executives wanted. The movie made $28.7 million globally, which is twice as much as its $15 million budget. But that seemed like small change next to George Lucas' kingdom. Plans to sell toys fell through, toys disappeared before they could be made, and the hope for franchise shriveled. Even though The Last Starfighter tried hard, it couldn't get away from the long shadow of Star Wars. It wasn't an empire that ruled the galaxy, it was a fable about a cult that needed to be found again. At first, it looked like The Last Starfighter would fade away. It wasn't a failure, but it wasn't a huge hit either, it was merely a small sci-fi oddity in the crowded summer of 1984. But then there was cable and VHS. Replays late at night. People who missed it in theaters found it at home, where they could replay the arcade-like combat, quote Robert Preston's clever one-liners, and dream of high scores that could change their life. By the 1990s, it had gone from being a forgotten experiment to a cult treasure. For a lot of people, it wasn't just another sci-fi movie. The movie made them believe that computers could create worlds as huge as their imaginations. The Last Starfighter never did well at the box office, but it did well in the long run. Living on in the hearts of fans who found it on TV screens, VCRs, and other devices. 20 years after it came out, The Last Starfighter earned a surprise encore, not as a movie, but on stage. In 2004, New York's Storm Theater turned the interstellar adventure into a full-fledged, campy musical. The show lent on the film's cheesy charm with interstellar ballads, duets about fate, and chorus numbers that sounded like arcade bleeps. It wasn't a huge hit on Broadway, but it didn't have to be. The musical showed fans that The Last Starfighter had built up a large enough fan base to span genres. At one point, cutting-edge CGI was used to show the Gunsters' battles. Now they were sung in the spotlight, which was strange but sincere, a reminder that the movie's imagination was too broad to stay in one medium. What should we do? We pass away. Big stars, like Seth Rogen and Steven Spielberg's Amblin Entertainment, were interested in the project, but legal issues and studio doubts hindered it from getting off the ground. Scripts were written, ideas were pitched, but nothing was ready to go. But admirers never gave up hope. The Last Starfighter seems like a good choice for a rebirth because it has a cult following in CGI that can finish what 1984 started. Alex Rogan may never have come back to the Gunstar on screen, but the dream won't die. Every rumor and every new pitch keeps the cockpit warm. The Last Starfighter started as a daydream in an arcade and became one of the first movies to show that computers could make worlds that seemed as real as models in matte paintings. It almost had Michael J. Fox and James Cameron, and it pushed through weak technology that could have broken down at any moment. It gave Robert Preston his last movie, Stardust, and it offered sci-fi enthusiasts a cult classic that lived on through VHS, cable, and late-night reruns. It never turned into the next Star Wars. But maybe that was the point. It was smaller, rougher, and stranger, and that's what made it so memorable. This one was for you if you ever sat at an arcade machine and wished it was more than just a game. Leave a comment. Let us know which cult masterpiece we should start next. Because the top score isn't always on a screen. The story's legacy is what it leaves behind.